on Twitter as well. Our next guest this morning is Debra Mason. She's among the leading scholars, trainers, and entrepreneurs of religion in the news media. She brings more than 30 years of professional and scholarly experience to her position as director of the Pew-funded Center on Religion and the Professions, an interdisciplinary center at the world-renowned Missouri School of Journalism, the oldest school of journalism in the United States. Founding director of its nonprofit arm, the Religion News Service. She worked with that organization for 2 decades, publisher emeritus of the Religion News Service, RNS, as it's called, the world's only non-sectarian wire service exclusively covering religion. And Dr. Mason, please come on up. Right. And I'd love to introduce you to our audience here. You're going to be talking about God's will, evangelicals, the media, and Trump.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Can you hear me okay? Is everything good? No. Uh-oh. Maybe I'm not on. I'm going to get obscene up here already.
Let's see here.
You want to pull it off?
You're on.
Okay.
I'll check you out.
Okay. Okay, great. I can shout. I have kids. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you to Dean Marin and her staff for the warm welcome and to this beautiful facility here. You certainly have a tremendous school of journalism here, and I'm honored to be here. So last January, Donald Trump paid a visit to Liberty University. It's a university founded by moral majority leader and televangelist Jerry Falwell. And during the visit, he was clearly looking at his notes as he quoted a verse from the Bible, from the New Testament. And he referred to it as 2 Corinthians. Now, if you watch the video, you can hear a little bit of snickering. I hear a little bit of snickering out there. And pretty much, if you were raised Christian or know very much about the Christian New Testament, you know that virtually nobody calls it 2 Corinthians, right? It's 2 Corinthians. And what we saw immediately was a candidate who was not religiously literate in even a very basic way. So about the same time as that visit, about a year ago, the Pew Research Center did a survey, and they asked the public to rank the presidential candidates based on perceptions of religiosity. So any guesses as to who came out on top at that time? Again, this was a year ago. You had most of the GOP candidates were still in the running. Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton were still in the running. Who came out on top? Huckabee did not come out on top, came in second. Ben Carson came in first. He came in, about 70% of the people said that he was at least very or somewhat religious, religiously motivated. And who was at the bottom? Who was at the bottom? Donald Trump. 5% of the people polled said that Trump was very religious. Another 25% said that he was somewhat religious. So how did Donald Trump, an essentially non-practicing Protestant, Presbyterian by tradition, thrice married, known philanderer, casino builder, with little apparent religious literacy, how did he get more support from evangelical Christians than George Bush, John McCain, or Mitt Romney? He had 81% of support of white evangelical Christians. I'm going to say that again. Donald Trump got more support from white evangelical Christians than George W. Bush, John McCain, or Mitt Romney. Now, if you're scratching your heads as to why, there's a simple answer, and then I'll explain a little more nuanced answer. And the simple answer is, as you probably guessed, the U.S. Supreme Court the potential to fill vacancies for this president, and the issue of overturning Roe v. Wade. Or as one woman who was quoted in the Columbia Missourian newspaper at an anti-abortion rally, I didn't make this quote up, I swear, quote, "We know he's a little naughty," she said of President Donald Trump, quote, "but he loves the babies. God's people came out this election. It was awesome. Catholics, Protestants, the Ku Klux Klan, everyone came out for the babies." Didn't make it up. So let's add some nuance to this. Writing in Time magazine last November, pollster Robbie Jones, he polls for PRRI, an organization he runs, he noted that perhaps the most dramatic example of the shift in white evangelical political ethics is the way in which white evangelicals have evaluated the personal character of public officials, end quote. When Jones polled the public about 4 years earlier, right before the 2012 election, he found that only 30% of white evangelical Protestants said politicians could commit moral acts in their private lives and still be an ethically validated public servant. These so-called values voters, as we sometimes call evangelicals, particularly white evangelicals, radically changed their views by 2016 when, doing the same question, the same polling, Jones found that 70% said a politician could, in Jones's words, build a kind of moral wall between their private and public life. Put another way, The Atlantic's Jonathan Merritt, a columnist there who also writes for Religion News Service, noted that in the 1980s, Bill Clinton was called debauched, debased, and defamed by televangelist Pat Robertson. Yet Robertson had several uncritical visits by Trump on his Christian broadcasting network, still one of the largest Christian broadcasting networks around. And in one broadcast, he even told Trump, "You inspire us all." Pollster Robbie Jones says that to understand this change, we need to understand white evangelicals' sense of diminishing power and the waning of their cultural worldview. So consider this. It was the first election, the 2016 election, was the first election in which white evangelicals, once called the moral majority, were in a minority on certain cultural issues. These issues have been called the culture wars, and notably they are abortion and LGBTQ rights. In 2008, about 40% of the U.S. population supported LGBTQ rights, or specifically same-sex marriage. Now it's legal in all 50 states. Public support for gay marriage is at about 60% today. In a poll from this January, the Pew Research Center reported that 57% of the public said abortion should be legal in all or most cases. So in 4 short years, the moral majority went from being the majority to being the moral minority. I'm going to just stop a minute and explain that evangelicals as a whole make up about 25% of the U.S. population, and there are lots of different definitions of who gets classified as an evangelical. It's not a denomination, it's not one tradition, but the key markers are that evangelicals believe in the truth of the Bible as the Word of God, and they believe that the only route to salvation and eternal life is belief in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. But just like all religious markers, there's a wide distinction between people who may call themselves evangelicals. And so I want to make it clear that most of my comments today refer to the most conservative of evangelical Christians. We also focus on white evangelicals because pollsters know and social scientists know that they vote very differently from black evangelicals, and they are a much larger part of the evangelical population. So I just wanted to acknowledge that certainly there were many evangelicals actually who said they couldn't vote for Trump. In fact, they stayed home on election day. So I've laid out some reasoning for support of Donald Trump by the most conservative evangelical voters, and what the role that this overwhelming support played in, I'm going to now talk about the role that this overwhelming support played in spreading of fake news or alternative news, and even a rise in hate speech. And I'm going to spend the rest of my talk on this. And I'm going to focus on 3 trends. First, I'll just call it the dominance of the 20th century scientific discovery and theories such as evolution and rationalism. I know, I'm going to get into history. And second is the growing secularism in Western culture. And third is the development of alternative institutions and media that catered to a significant demographic of conservative Christians. So to point 1, every student of U.S. popular science knows the role of evolution that evolution played in transforming what's taught in public education during the 20th century. And if you recall the 1925 Scopes trial, Scopes monkey trial, was about a Bible Belt state law, in this case Tennessee, that prohibited the teaching of evolution. Now, evolution was, as evidenced by the Scopes trial and elsewhere, a direct repudiation of the biblical descriptions of creation. Evolution challenged the notion of humanity's God-ordained dominion over the earth about 6,000 years ago. As evolution grew to become validated by scholars, by the public, and in the media, some white evangelicals felt a growing alienation from mainstream society. And this one example has, time and time again, played out over as new discoveries push knowledge of scientific truths across the universe, about the universe. Despite this, surveys show that the Old Testament book of Genesis and their Genesis creation stories, and there are stories, multiple ones, are held as literal truth by about 60% of evangelicals. Most mainstream, mainline Protestants and Catholics have found theological ways to reconcile the understanding of evolution and their interpretations of sacred scriptures. But if you think people have forgotten about the Scopes trial, you need to go to Petersburg, Kentucky, where the Creation Museum exists, was built 10 years ago, has about 300 employees. They raised $27 million to build it, and it features dinosaurs living at the same time as humans. I consider that an alternative fact. So to point number 2, the Scopes trial and the subsequent adoption of scientific knowledge was just one indicator of a changing culture. And we also know that in Western culture we are becoming more secular. And through culture, we display the secularism, and including in the media. So as newspapers, radio stations, television stations, and other industries professionalized and specialized, evangelicals saw and still see very little of themselves portrayed accurately in the media. It's actually a huge problem. Largely, the absence of evangelicals in the media reflected the relatively high church-state wall up until about 1980 that meant evangelicals rarely ventured into public debates. But after the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, after the freewheeling era of the 1960s, evangelicals and the Southern Baptist Convention, particularly the largest and still the largest single evangelical denomination in the country. They decided that the time to remain a passive voice in public debate was over, and they began running for office. They began campaigning around national elections. Pat Robertson was key, in fact, to helping organize ways to train evangelicals to run for school boards and so on and so forth, beginning in the 1980s. That's also when we started seeing pickets of abortion clinics, more legal fights over school prayer, and efforts by religious groups to have equal access in public venues such as schools. Now, this increased visibility of evangelicals in politics, however, did nothing to stall this march of secularism in the U.S. And the number of people claiming no religious affiliation doesn't mean that they're necessarily atheists or agnostics, but people who say they don't have a specific religious tradition is now currently at almost 25%. It used to be just 10 years ago at about 16%. And those of you who are in college are, at this time in history, the least religious cohort in our history, and is predicted to remain so as you grow older, a trend that's been very different from previous generations that tend to become more religious after their post-college years. So our secular culture further highlighted the white evangelicals' need to play defense, so to speak, against a culture, a society that was heading on a path toward damnation. Now, throughout this time, the media, and those of us who have worked in journalism know that for much of the public, this means everything from infomercials to the latest Disney princess, the media became identified with and blamed for spreading secularist views. And this phrase, secular media, kind of slid off the tongues of evangelicals, of televangelists, slid off in a very smooth way, as if it was all one word, secular media. It wasn't a compliment. So by the time white evangelicals became politically active, religion news coverage did expand. And although there are several hundred specialists who write about religion in the U.S. today, and although they do a very competent job, they are still a very small number compared to the non-specialists. And there are many examples of mainstream media coverage that is insulting and offensive to evangelicals in the stereotypes that are portrayed. I'll just mention a couple of them throughout the years. So this is an old one dating back to probably when some of your parents were kids, if you're in college. But in 1976, when Jimmy Carter, he was running for president, he said he was a born-again Christian. NBC anchor John Chancellor told millions of viewers, quote, "We've checked this out. Being born again is not a bizarre mountaintop experience," end quote. 2 decades later, the Washington Post, on its front page, described followers of the Christian right as, quote, "largely poor, uneducated, and easy to command," end quote. And then as recent as 2011, in an article that was describing Mike Huckabee, who at the time was still a presidential candidate, they described him this way, quote, "People are sometimes caught off guard by Huckabee's intellectual competence because of his rural Arkansas habits and his outspoken evangelical views." So, that kind of coverage doesn't help our reputation in the mainstream media. So by now you're getting this vision of white evangelicals as feeling besieged. They felt embattled against the culturally dominant acceptance of evolution. They felt more isolated by the growing secularism and misrepresentation by the religiously illiterate press. So it's not surprising that throughout this time, huge networks of alternative institutions were created. These were think tanks, they were educational institutions, they were centers, they were media entities, and all these alternative institutions kind of fed these evangelical Christians, and they thrived throughout the 20th century. The news was recast with a Christian spin. In addition, media watchdogs of every major faith emerged. Some have been around for many, many years, but many related to evangelical Christians emerged, and they were constantly dissing the secular media and casting doubt on the veracity of mainstream media and its ability to fairly depict anything from politics to education to health to war, and most certainly to religion. These alternative media created alternative facts in the image of their conservative Christian audiences. Christopher Douglas, he was writing in Religion Dispatches, put it this way. I think it's a little bit harsh, and I wouldn't exactly phrase it this way, but I think it's a good quote. Quote, "The consequence is that theologically fundamentalist Christians have for years explained to themselves that what seems to be a worldly wisdom and conclusions are really the results of conspiracies, biases, and misplaced human pride in academic, scientific, and journalist communities. This cognitive training to reject expert knowledge and to seek alternative, more amenable explanations has helped disarm the capacity for critical thinking and analysis." In fact, a BuzzFeed analysis of fake news sites reported that fake news leads is more engaged among social and political conservatives than liberals. So evangelical media have been creating alternative media for decades. There are sites such as The World, Christian Post, they're more mainstream, but there are literally hundreds and hundreds of others that exist. Now, finally, as a specialist in religion and media, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the rise in hate speech that's going on today and how it's affecting people of diverse faiths. There's a measurable rise in anti-Semitic vandalism and bomb threats going on across the nation as we speak. Anti-Muslim activities have spiked nearly 200% in the past 2 years, according to the Southern Poverty Law Institute. And I don't really have time to talk about this or talk about the role that evangelicalism has played in stoking Islamophobia or the adoption of this clash of civilizations worldview that can be found among some of the most conservative evangelicals. But in Missouri alone, consider that just in the past month, we had 2 people who were shot, mistakenly identified as Muslims in Kansas City. One of them died. We had more than 100 tombstones that were turned over and vandalized in St. Louis. At the University of Missouri campus in Columbia, where I live, they've arrested someone for taunting a Jewish student with anti-Semitic slurs. So it's real, it's going on, and it's really ugly. This is religious-based hate, and the media have a role to speak out against it and a responsibility to correct the religious illiteracy that fuels it. So in conclusion, I should have lots of time for questions. I want to share just another anecdote. I do a lot of training around the globe, and in November we were doing trainings in Cape Town, South Africa, training 15 journalists from 15 sub-Sahara countries on covering religion and LGBTQ issues. And these were professional journalists, and I asked these journalists if the phrase, quote, homosexuality is a sin, end quote, is a fact or is an opinion. Now, there was a lot of quiet, and nobody said anything for a while. Maybe they figured I was somehow doing a rhetorical trick on them. But finally, some brave soul raised his hand, and he said, it's a fact, because it's in the Bible. And I said, which Bible? Now, what I knew from their response was that for many of these journalists, the Bible was factual history and rulemaking. The contradictions within it, the literary flourishes, the challenges of translation, the historical critical understanding of how the Bible even came to be formed meant nothing. The prevalence of evangelical theology and worldviews across the globe, often imported by U.S. ministries, suggests that the propensity for fake news and alternative facts is not just U.S.-based. Well, we already know that. It's very well not U.S.-based. It's not a problem that's going to go away. It's rather a reflection on a population that has been consuming alternative media for decades, and for them, it is those of us who complain about alternative facts and alternative media are whining, or secular media whining about cultural elitist things that, and whining about losing an election in a very big way. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you would like. So.
All right, thank you, Professor. And I'll make my way to the back of the room here. And I'll get around to everybody here, so as best as I can. And yes, sir.
What are your observations about this emerging neurological debate that most of our opinions and biases as adults were baked in at birth?
I would say I'm not a scientist. I'm not a neuroscientist. I mean, I think that's a theological question. I think that's I think that's an example of something we still don't know a lot about. Personally do not have the worldview or rather I should say I have the worldview that we are shaped by things that occur in our life, and that we are not determined to be one thing or another at birth. So that's very much what I believe.
I think this gentleman here.
We hear a lot about evangelicals, for better or for worse, in the press, and with your point on accuracy is very well taken. But it seems to me that other varieties of Christianity are essentially ignored, that the only form of Christianity that gets reported on is the evangelical, and the more extreme version of evangelical, the better.
Well, it is true that when evangelicals are covered, that it tends to be the most conservative. The moderate evangelicals are rarely covered, other than opinion columns or occasionally when they're involved in some political event or something. But you're correct about that. The actual scholarship shows that actually the most covered denomination is the Roman Catholic Church, and particularly coverage of the Pope. Outweighs everything. Part of that is because the only other place in the world where you have a huge number of people who specialize in covering religion are the Vaticanistas, who are in Rome and cover the Pope, particularly this Pope. When you have a popular Pope, in fact, Pope John Paul II was popular, and this Pope is quite popular as well, and there's a lot of coverage of the Pope's actions. You are correct that coverage of religion is a small percentage of the news. It's less than 2% of coverage in the news. It's gone kind of up and down. Every once in a while, editors decide that they need somebody who can specialize in covering religion. This is one of those times. BuzzFeed, or rather Vox, for instance, is advertising for a religion specialist. I think BuzzFeed was advertising for somebody who would cover specifically Islam. So we're seeing a little bit of an uptick right now. We'll see a downtick. I'm old enough, I've been around for the upticks and the downticks. You are right that it is not covered very well. And that has been one of the reasons for alternative media to emerge, and for people who don't see themselves covered. Mainstream media, the only story that gets covered about not mainstream media, but I mean mainline Protestants. The only story really that's prevalent much about mainline Protestants is their decline. In their decline in numbers. Mainline Protestants are people like the Episcopal Church, United Methodists, ELCA Lutherans, American Baptists, United Church of Christ, various groups that used to be quite powerful in the, as public intellectuals say, in the 50s and even the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement, but have been declining significantly in numbers. And that's pretty much the only story you read very much about mainline Protestants. So.
I have a question over here, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean any disrespect at all with this question. I just wanted to examine this from a journalistic standpoint. So at the centerpiece of your presentation, you cited a study from BuzzFeed on the headlines of the alternative news, whereas BuzzFeed's Snapchat headline this morning is "Your Illustrated Guide to Stealthy Farting." So
Yeah.
what is BuzzFeed at the center of these news organizations that publicly had a countdown clock on Facebook the night that Trump got elected of how long until his tenure is over as president? How do news organizations like that have come out as not moderate at all have a place in our society and in the studies of these evangelical Christians and the alternative news headlines?
So I should correct. First of all, BuzzFeed has a lot of trash, and it clickbait. That's obvious, right? But they also have investigative reporters, and they also have done studies. The study that I was citing was not based on evangelicals. What it was looking at was looking at the sources for fake news, and they were looking at engagement. So they were looking at data about engagement of fake news, and by engagement, what we mean is shares, likes, and so on social media. So they were using social science research to study the prominence of fake news and they looked at it from whether they were liberal sites or conservative sites. So what I said in my presentation is that conservative sites had far more engagement, by 2 to 1. That's pretty significant. Engagement than the liberal sites. There's a lot more data there. It's it's a pretty detailed study if you want to find it. So, yeah.
Right here, and then we'll come to you, sir, and we'll make our way through the room.
Thank you. What do you think? In your presentation, you had said that people had an increase on personal life and the wall. So what do you think caused the increase of percentage of people that agreed with public officials could build such a moral wall between personal life and public in the time period?
Yeah, I have no idea. I don't know. And I haven't really seen a good analysis of that either. That's a great question. In 4 years, that's a big difference. They used the same question when they surveyed. I don't know. We also saw a shifting of viewpoints in the last election with Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama, in that a lot of evangelicals had a pretty antagonistic relationship with the Mormon Church, which Mitt Romney was a member. And what we saw shifting opinion there. Now, Mitt Romney, of course, was, well regarded as being, the epitome of the family man and a highly moral individual. So you had very different kinds of candidates, and whether people rationalize based on who they felt they needed to support, I don't know. That's a very good question. Do you have an answer? No. Good question.
First of all, thank you for your speech. I thought that was very interesting. I found it really fascinating that you traced the history of this alternative media consumption back almost 100 years, back to a trial in 1925. And so with that, and with this new development of people caring less about the private lives of politicians, my question is, do you think that Donald Trump and the Conservative Party are knowingly capitalizing on some of these people who are feeling marginalized? And then the other part of my question is, what do you think that development away from caring about the private life says about the future of the fake news argument and the relationship between Christians and the media?
Wow, those are hard questions.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. In terms of the first question, really beginning with Ronald Reagan, the GOP has been very good about cultivating religious voters. And, Karl Rove really made it an art form with George W. Bush's election. And so, this group of voters has been key. I mean, when you're talking about 25% of the U.S. population, that's a big chunk. The other demographic that's important is that the Roman Catholic population is also about 26%. The Roman Catholic Church's official position, of course, is against abortion. And if you can get enough evangelical Christians, enough Roman Catholics to vote for you, you can win. Roman Catholics have become the biggest swing vote in this country, demographically the biggest chunk of independent voters. They no longer identify primarily as Democratic as they did, say, during JFK's time. So I think, this has been part of the political game plan for a long time. And I don't think, Donald Trump didn't win. Donald Trump and Kellyanne Conway didn't just, win on their own. This was really, you had the GOP party very much involved, and I think it was a really smart mining of the data and the history and the strategies that they have, and to make sure that their platform recognized some of these views that some evangelicals do not see in the Democratic platforms.
About 5 minutes left, and I've got
sorry, I didn't get your other
to get
question.
through here,
Okay.
and I will begin with this gentleman.
Sorry.
Are you now, or have you ever been affiliated with an organized religion yourself?
I have a master's in theology degree from a Lutheran Church in America. It used to be LCA, now it's ELCA church. I don't actually disclose my religious affiliations anymore, but I very much was raised in a denomination, a mainline Protestant denomination. I have been very active. So, yeah. The answer is yes.
All right, so when you were talking about how the media has a responsibility to correct illiterate religious errors, do you feel as if that goes for all religions, such as Buddhism and Islamic beliefs, or just the ones that believe in the Christian God? Because you only really favored the Christian religion during your whole speech.
Right. So I was talking about evangelical Christians primarily, and I was talking about the alternative media and that have developed in this country and that reflect the a large voting bloc in this country. So this country identifies as overwhelmingly Christian, depending on the survey, 65%, 80%. So those are the largest chunks of voters, and that's what I was speaking to. However, we have a huge problem in covering minority religions in this country. We have a huge underrepresentation of evangelicals in the media, in newsrooms. There's only about, the last survey that was done, there are only about 5% of journalists identify as evangelical. There are even fewer who identify as Muslim, as Buddhist, as Hindu. All, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, Sikhs, Wiccans, any other sort of group that is non-Christian but still classifies itself as a religious tradition in this country, you add them all up together and there's still less than 8% of our entire U.S. population. So we have a tremendous problem. We don't know our neighbors of other faiths, and we don't know how to cover them accurately, and we do a lousy job of it. So no, we have a responsibility to cover every religion accurately. I was talking about evangelicals because on this particular issue, there's been a tradition and a trajectory in which evangelical Christianity relates directly to the idea of fake news and alternative facts.
We have one more question here, and then we'll take a break.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at the history of the different branches of government, specifically Congress and the president have been dominated by Protestant Christians. But then if we look at the Supreme Court, it's almost unanimously Catholic. Or Jewish. So do you think Trump will use the empty chair ambiguities to try and further the evangelical Christian views onto the Supreme Court so that way he can get his executive orders passed, or do you think he's going to sit on that and let things play their course?
If I figured that out, I could probably be kind of much wealthier than I am. But I would say that I don't, you know, when you look at polling on of the general population and the kinds of people that they want to see elected or see in Congress or wherever, they prefer people of faith. So it's always been said that it's, you know, it'd be very hard to get elected as an avowed atheist, for instance. I think this year there were reports of maybe the first person who identified as atheist or agnostic. I can't remember precisely, so I hate to say that, but we now have a handful, I want to say maybe 2 Muslims in Congress, so things are changing very slowly. But, you know, the reality is that the official position of the Roman Catholic Church is against abortion. So if he appoints people who are, I think no matter what, he's going to appoint people. He has pledged to appoint people who are staunchly opposed to abortion in their past case history. So, thank you.
A round of applause for Professor Debra Mason, University of Missouri. Thank you very much, Debra.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute break. The dean has an announcement to make.
Okay, folks, there will be a sack lunch available and some water and so on. We want you all to go out that door and come back in this door.